Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this month's Instant Insight webinar. Today, David Lover is joining us to talk about TLS security certificates. Just a few notes as we go through the presentation. All lines are on mute. If you do have a question, you can type it in the questions box. We will try to get to as many as possible. After today's webinar, we will be sending out a copy of the presentation. And with that said, Dave, I'll hand the line over to you. How are you doing on this first day of autumn?
Well, it's for one, in Minnesota, it is ridiculously rainy. We have mass flooding everywhere
Oh,
throughout the major metro.
so I
So
guess
it's
not that great.
no, well, it's yeah, it's just it certainly feels like fall a little bit. Yeah, it's a little wet for a fall, but no, it's good. But I was thinking kind of the last 3 months we've had Chad Frazier with us, right? And I feel like you and I should just have a conversation about security certificates this whole time, but from our conversation before, I don't think you'd be interested in participating in that. So,
Probably not. I'm probably not the most qualified. No.
no, but if anybody missed our summer series on data center, all the way from from virtualization and security and networking, all that, we had a great time over the summer, and it was literally kind of an open, a little bit too formal for a podcast, but it was a fun conversation. So go check that out for sure on our website. This topic, on the other hand, is getting back to our roots as a nitty-gritty deep dive, and I think hopefully a lot of people have heard that Avaya is kind of changing their policy. Now, Avaya will say that they haven't really changed their policy. This is the way it was in the beginning, but I have serious doubts about that statement. So bottom line is we have to now pay attention to security certificates. And I, for one, I kind of consider myself pretty savvy in the ways of Avaya world, and I didn't have a clue what security certificates were all about. I knew them. I knew that when I went to https://mybank.com, I knew that there was an SSL cert somewhere in there, but I didn't have the foggiest idea how they worked and what really the role beyond identification and identification and privacy. What role did they play? And so, for me as an educator, I'd say, well, the best way to learn a topic is to commit myself to doing a webinar or commit myself to doing a user group presentation, and that'll often gives me a deadline. I have to figure it out. I have to learn it. And over that, the amount of research I was doing and the amount of talking to customers and the subsequent presentations of this session, I'm finding out there's a ton of people in telecom that don't have a clue about security certificates. And you can't go on like that in this day and age. So this is where this has become a very popular topic, and it certainly is showing by the number of people that we have on this call. So again, thanks for joining us today. So this session, I only get you for an hour. So I can't. Let me tell you what this isn't going to be. It isn't going to be oh good, you can walk away from this and you are a master of everything and you know exactly how to deploy this and convert this on your Avaya system. I'd love that to be that, but I'd literally need days, if not weeks, to pull that off. So what I am going to do is talk to you about what certificates are, because I'm finding there's a ton of people that don't really know. They've heard of them. You've even may have heard of PKI, but you don't really, probably might not know the difference between a security certificate and a certificate authority. Two totally different concepts, really centered around trust. Do I trust that? I mean, sure, you show me your certificate, but do I trust that it's real? I mean, who does that? Well, that's about the authority, and well, if you trust the authority, then you trust the certificate that the authority has signed. And so we'll talk about that. We'll talk certainly about Avaya's use of security certificates and where this comes into play within your infrastructure, and even giving you some migration tips and how do you approach this, and what are some of the things that you have to think about and the strategies involved in that. And because again, it's not easy. For one, we're finding out that as much as Avaya wants everybody to move in this direction, there is no one document that says, here, follow this step by step and you're in good shape. And we're finding that most of the products within the Avaya portfolio address it in slightly different ways. So you have to understand the concept to be able to make the transition from, oh, well, this is how Communication Manager does it. Oh, this is how Session Manager does it. Oh, this is how Aura Messaging does it. Because sometimes they like to give you a cute little wizard to do it and allow you to be oblivious to the inner workings of it. And then other times you're like, no, you got to go do it yourself. So you know me, I'm always a big fan of understanding the details, understanding the guts of it, so that no matter which model they present to you, you understand what's happening behind the scenes. So that's our plan. That's what we're going to do today. And I can guarantee I'm going to go over a little bit, so hopefully you can hang out for a little bit more, but I'll try my best to keep us on track for that hour. So again, there are two big topics that you need to understand related to this, and it's the idea of this identity, that we'll just call kind of generically a certificate or an identity certificate. And as I mentioned before, it's really doing two different things. It's providing identity, meaning that when you go to mybank.com and it's protected by a certificate, that it's not being spoofed and you're not technically going to hackerbank.com, right? So there's some aspects of identity. You guys see this every single day. If you're an Avaya customer, you go to log into the maintenance web interface of Communication Manager, and the very first thing you're presented with is an error message from the browser, from Chrome or from, God forbid, Internet Explorer, saying, hey, there's something wrong with the certificate. There's one here, but it doesn't match the credentials of the server. And so you say, yeah, thanks, I know what I'm doing. I go there anyway. That's because it's failing the identity portion of that cert. The privacy, on the other hand, is still working behind the scenes, encrypting the traffic from point A to point B. The problem with this is that those keys are no longer deemed secure. And you've seen this all over the place, right? If you've heard of the SHA-1 cert or the SHA-2 cert, really having to do with the strength of the cipher that's being used to encrypt traffic between point A and point B. Yeah, you're seeing it on SAL, right? Hopefully everybody on this call is aware that if you don't do something with your SAL, your secure access link that provides remote access and alarming, soon that SAL is going to stop working, right? Because the SHA-1 certs that are currently installed on SAL are expiring December 31st. And so you have to upgrade those, the SAL gateway, to ultimately get to the SHA-2 cert, where, okay, good. Not only is it strong, it's 2,048 bits versus the old SHA-1 of 1,024 bits, but it's also well, the strength is the big thing that really comes into that, but bottom line is the expiration. And Avaya, if you haven't done anything, Avaya is going to help you, maybe without your knowledge, on starting October 3rd, where they are going to start pushing an updated cert to all of your SALs if you don't tell them. And unfortunately, it's actually going to break part of the capability of the SAL and the ability to upgrade that SAL. So they're going to fix it for you if you haven't done anything with it. So definitely all you have to do is go to support.avaya.com and you will see it plastered everywhere about how you need to take action on your SAL. And it's all very customer installable. Avaya's done a great job with that. Bottom line is that it's this whole thing of this migration of certificates, and the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, they're the ones that are coming out and saying, yeah, SHA-1 certs aren't good enough anymore. And Avaya's existing cert that comes preloaded on almost every piece of Avaya gear is a SHA-1 cert. And so most of you probably already know this. You're failing your security audits. Your security guys are coming in saying, hey, you've got a SHA-1 cert over there, you've got to get rid of it. And this whole thing that I'm going to talk about today is the idea of what we need to do to move forward with that. So again, the big magic is, one, they're out of date. Two, they are ultimately going to not be installed by default. Like if you go to R7, there is no quote-unquote demo cert installed on a new 7 system. Now they are kind of kept during an upgrade, but that is not a good reason to to leave it because it still is a crappy cert that we need to deal with. So we're going to look at adopting and maintaining a certificate strategy and figure out what's involved in that. Again, there are two things that are involved in a certificate, right? There's an identity cert, and there's a thing called a certificate authority. Those are two, and technically they're both certs or certificates, but they're very different. One says, who am I? Think of that as a driver's license, right? I have a driver's license. The state of Minnesota has issued it, and so in that case, the state of Minnesota is the certificate authority, and because the state of Minnesota signed it, then I trust, and most of the people in Minnesota trust, that it's a valid identity certificate and it says it's Dave Lover. Yes, in fact it is, because again, you trust the state of Minnesota. Interestingly enough, the Department of Homeland Security doesn't trust the Minnesota driver's license. I almost learned this the hard way. I had a customer meeting in the Pentagon, and as I was going through security, up on the sign says you must present one valid form of identification. A driver's license is acceptable unless you're from one of these 4 states. And so that's a big topic. Anybody who lives in Minnesota knows this all too well about just the goofiness of the Minnesota driver's license. Anyway, we're talking about trust and scope of trust. The state of Minnesota views it as a completely valid driver's license. But outside of the state of Minnesota, they do not view it as a valid driver's license. So it's a scope of trust, and that applies directly to this world of security certificates and the identity that is in there. Now, I can tell you, where my driver's license is a card, right? You can read it. Well, in the world of these certificates we're talking about here, it's really a file. It's a text file you can open up, you can read it. It's got an encryption key. It's got some data in it. It's got encrypted data in it. And you basically load that file in, and the system, the operating system, or maybe even the application is going to use that to demonstrate identity to anybody who asks for it, as well as provide the encryption to go with it. So we're going to talk about some of the types of authorities, right? On this next slide here, we talk about the certificate authority and who are they? Are they public? Are they private? Just like a DID extension and a non-DID extension, right? There's no point of wasting good DID extensions on something as goofy as a data module or an announcement, right? We use non-DID extensions for that. Well, in the world of certificate authorities, we do the same thing. We say, well, I have so many devices inside my enterprise that why don't we just have my own certificate authority be the signer of the internal stuff, and we'll only use the external or the public or the third-party certs for the things that are outside of my network. When you want to come to our webinar, I had to make sure that you could get there securely without having any issues or fearing that your computer doesn't trust, in this case, go to webinar.com. And so we use third-party certs for a lot of these things. There's also a thing, that the certificate authority maintains a thing called a certificate revocation list, or a CRL. And the CRL is just a list of certificates that the certificate authority no longer trusts. So, if you say, well, the state of Minnesota signed Kelly's driver's license, and then all of a sudden they publish a document every so often saying, hey, I told you that we can trust Kelly. We can't trust Kelly. So if Kelly ever presents her driver's license, it's fake. Don't trust it. And so that is documented in a CRL. So every certificate authority has the ability to provide this CRL list and offer it up to anybody who wants it. Publicly, that's a big deal. On private ones, I don't know how many people really pay attention to that, but it's ultimately saying that they're no longer reliable, where they used to be, but they aren't anymore. So there's a whole bunch of different things that it comes to when a certificate authority signs a certificate. So and sometimes it's the device itself. Let's say I've got a session manager. Right, a session manager needs some identity certs so that when you go to the session manager user interface or you are sending a SIP message to a session manager, we're going to check the certificate on the session manager and ensure that it's valid. Well, the question is, how did we get that? How did you get that cert? And at some point, the the session manager has the ability to create a cert. It's not valid yet because nobody's signed it, and then they can give it to somebody, hopefully, right, a certificate authority, to say, yep, I'm willing to put my seal of approval on that validates that it's a trustable certificate. So you do that. Interestingly enough, with Session Manager, that is one of those things that is slightly automated. You don't have to worry about it the same way you do some of the other ones. When you build a Session Manager, you enroll the Session Manager with System Manager. Well, it's because System Manager is technically, or has the ability to be, a certificate authority. And when you enroll Session Manager, you're behind the scenes passing this thing called a CSR, or a certificate signing request. Think of it as like a little form that you fill out, and you maybe include your unsigned certificate with it. And then the certificate authority looks at it and says, oh, hey, you want me to sign this? Let me verify it. Yeah, everything's good. In the case of Session Manager, you knew the enrollment password. All is good. Let's go ahead and sign that and give it back to you. So that's one thing. Others, like the CSR, maybe it's manual. And this is what happens in a lot of normal environments where you have a device that needs an identity cert to issue a CSR to a certificate authority, a CA, and they'll sign it and give it back to you. And now how that happens, like whether it's, it might include the desired encryption key with it, with the signing request, or maybe it doesn't, and that's kind of what determines whether it's a PEM formatted certificate or a PKCS12 formatted certificate. It really depends on whether or not it has the encryption key in it already, because otherwise I have to keep track of it. And this is where, if you ever issue a CSR, you have a way to say, hey, have I issued a CSR? Yes, you've issued a CSR, and you're waiting for the signed certificate to come back. Some of them don't support CSR, and so you say, oh, okay, I need somebody else to create it for me. And sometimes a certificate authority can build an identity cert from scratch. Clearly, it has to get a lot more information because it's not just looking at an existing certificate and then signing it. They're building the certificate, they're building the encryption key, they're building all of this stuff, and then just giving it to you. And then usually that's where it includes the encryption key in it, is where it'll have the PKCS12 format, and it'll have that private key built into it. So, again, we're talking high level so far, right? You've got an identity certificate, and you've got a certificate authority who signs certificates, identity certificates, and then technically that certificate authority has its own cert called a root cert, or a, what else will you hear it as? You'll hear it as a root cert, you'll hear it as a root CA, anything that defines that you want to proof that the certificate authority, that you trust them, right? Because at some point you say, well, I'm going to create my own driver's license, and you could say, well, duh, it says Dave Lover signed it, Dave Lover trusts it, and your first response should be, well, who the hell's Dave Lover? Why would I care if he signed it? That doesn't mean anything. I need an authorized signer. And you say, well, how do I tell people that Dave Lover is an authorized signer? And if you think about it and you go back to, again, kind of maybe the real world, you think about a notary public, right? A notary public has the same deal, and if you're going to, you sign a mortgage, you're going to sign that, and you're always going to have a notary public there putting their stamp, their notary stamp on it that says, hey, because you trust my stamp, you see that it's valid, you see that I'm a valid notary public, now you can trust that I viewed the signing of this. Same exact concept. So what you end up doing is when you get an identity cert, you are going to actually get two documents, right? Two files. The first one is, here is your identity cert that you asked for. Here is the root trust CA that you should give to everybody that you want to believe you, because now I signed it and they trust, right? So that's what we're talking about. Give you an example of this. That, in the world of, let's say, computers, right? This is my computer that I've got. It's my Windows. I think this is still Windows 10 when I took the screenshot. But there's a tool built into Windows called the Certificate Manager, and I can go into that Certificate Manager and see who are all of the certificate authorities that I trust? So if somebody presents me with an identity cert signed by GoDaddy, your computer goes in and says, well, God, do I trust GoDaddy? I'm like, oh yeah, I do trust GoDaddy. So any identity cert signed by GoDaddy, I'm going to trust. So this is the big list, and you can see a whole bunch of them that are in here that I guarantee you or your IT department had nothing to do with, like GoDaddy, like Microsoft, like Secure Trust, like Symantec, like Thought, like a whole bunch of them. But there's also some that are in here that you'll be like, well, this didn't come from the operating system. And by the way, when you get updates from Microsoft, right, your Patch Tuesday, or most recently, some of you might have upgraded your iPhone to iOS 10. I guarantee inside that update are updated certificate authority lists. That's part of, they'll say, oh, we're updating the security. Well, what they're doing is updating the list of certificate authorities that your iPhone trusts out of the box without you doing anything. But there's some in here that aren't publicly trusted, that didn't come with the operating system. For example, here at AeroSI, we have, and this goes back to our shared technologies days, we have a number of servers internally that were signed by a certificate authority from shared technologies. So those identity certificates were signed by a certificate authority called shared technologies. So my computer was told to trust that one because, again, we have a lot of internal documents. Now, the cool thing is that particular certificate authority was given to my PC through a thing called group policy. So you as an end user, me as an end user, did not manually install that certificate authority trust cert. It was given to us through group policy. Same way with this one called the SIP Product Certificate Authority. That's actually the crappy Avaya, what Avaya calls the demo cert. So what I did was I pulled it out of System Manager and I gave it to our IT department and said, hey, do me a favor and push this to every computer in our company. And they're like, oh, okay, great. And the next time all those computers logged in, they received that SIP Product Certificate Authority, which means soft phones work, right? If you've ever downloaded a fairly modern soft phone and you're using SIP and you're using TLS, it is going to say, hey, you need the cert. And what they're saying is you need the trust cert or the certificate authority, validating that you trust something signed by, in this case, System Manager. So it kind of shows you what's happening in that environment. You can also see, again, I'm a geek, if anybody ever doubted that, I have, as you might guess, a server at home. I bet a lot of us do, actually, but I have a Windows 2012 Essentials R2 that all of my media, all my music, all of my shared files, does all my backups, all that stuff. But I have told my server to be a certificate authority and can sign certificates for use inside my house. And the only way that's going to work is for you or somebody to have my certificate authority. Well, this is one where I do kind of some group policy, but I guess I haven't figured out how to push certs via group policy to my home computers. So what I did was I exported it out of that Windows server, and I manually installed it by double-clicking on the cert, and it said, oh, would you like to install this certificate? So bottom line is there's ways, right? It'll either come with the original operating system, you can push it via group policy, you can install it manually, and maybe when it comes to, there's probably a fourth way when you're talking about mobile devices where I can have your mobile management software, like we use Mobile Iron. And you might use that, you might use something else, but generally speaking, you can have the MDM, the mobile device management solution, push trusted certs to devices relevant to your enterprise. But even then, you can see how it's all about scope. Everybody on the planet is going to trust a cert signed by Symantec because you have that exact same certificate authority cert in your computer. Only computers within AeroSI will trust the shared technologies one because they distributed it only to the people in our company. And my server lover, which again, oddly, I tend to name all of my computer devices the same as my children. So I've got Alex Lover, I've got Ben Lover, and I've got Server Lover. It's one of my children. And so I distributed that to the PCs in my house You, outside of my house, since you don't have my certificate authority, would never trust any identity cert issued by my certificate authority because you don't have this thing that says to trust it. And that's what we're talking about. That is the whole idea of this, of what our goal is to make sure that you've, the ultimate goal is to replace all the identity certs. But you can't do that until you tell all the devices to trust that new identity cert. So how do we do that? Well, if we look at you know, and this kind of relates specifically to Avaya, we look at the various things. You know, one is you better come up with a strategy, because I've already shown you where you've got some public certificate authorities out there like Semantic and Thought and GoDaddy, whatever. You've got an enterprise certificate authority that is issued by your IT department, and I guarantee you have one. They'd be crappy IT people if they didn't have their own enterprise certificate authority. There is one somewhere in your enterprise. Maybe it's the system manager, right? Maybe it's the maybe you're going to do a combination of all of these, but you have to pick a strategy. Now, in reality, I think you do that last item as a hybrid. You're going to use maybe the public certificate authority for your public devices. You're going to use your enterprise certificate authority, which could be your existing one, or system manager could be your enterprise certificate authority, or again, some combination thereof. So the next thing we do is we have to find a way to, well, how do I know which ones, what do I need to change? That's a big topic and not an easy topic, but I'm going to give you some strategies that we can look at and some tips and tricks that we can do this. We'll create, ultimately we need to create those new identity certs, you know, via CSR if we can, or maybe through specific to Avaya with the enrollment password. Do not deploy those yet though, because ultimately we need to tell the devices to trust the root CA first. And so whoever is going to do the signing, you need to make sure that those devices have the root certificate first. Then you can go say, okay, now go put the identity certs on all the things, because now we know our devices trust them because they already have the root CA. So ultimately then, once we know that they will trust them, now you can start upgrading your identity certs to the new SHA-2, right? They're all shiny and sexy and everything's great and doing what we need it to do. We can test functionality, and ultimately the big test is, okay, you ready? The goal is to remove the support or the trusting of the old certificates. That's where the rubber meets the road. When you tell your computers to stop trusting the old crappy cert, that's when you know whether you've done it right, because you can actually tell your computer or your phones or your browsers or your whatever, hey, I want you to trust the new stuff and trust the old stuff. And you may think you've migrated all of your old crappy identity certs to the new things, but you won't really know until you've told your computers to stop trusting the old stuff. Then stuff starts to fail, and that's, in a way, it's a good thing, right? Because now, oh, there's something I forgot. Let's go fix that. So that's what we're going to talk about, and I'm going to kind of try to cover each one of these. I've got a whole bunch of questions in here that I should probably go look at before we get too terribly far.
Yep, thanks, David. Actually, I was going to interrupt you and say I think some of these are kind of relevant to what you're discussing, so thank you for
the topic. Oh, good. So one was more of a comment of, hey, OCSP is also used, Online Certificate Status Protocol. That's cool. I didn't know that existed. Thank you. Can a system manager certificate be signed so that it's more readily accepted? Yes, it can, and I'll show you an example of how we can do that. And that's another question that's really more of a comment, is the idea of an intermediate CA, and that's one of our strategies that we can talk about. To be honest, I find most IT departments aren't going to let you do it, but it is absolutely very much possible to do that. And then another comment, you named one of your children's server. Maybe I think of my physical server as a child, but yeah, yes, thanks for that commentary. Can I get a copy of the presentation? Yes. So Kelly answered that. She's going to send that stuff out, and there'll also be a recording of this that you can go back and, like, Dave talks really fast. Can I slow this down? Yeah, you can go do that. List of server application that shows which servers have security certs. Yes, and I'm going to show you that as well. So there's a way to find out what is connected to at least your session manager and what certs they're using. Excellent, thank you. Impact on CS1000. So it's a good question about CS1000. And even at a high level, I don't know if I've clearly explained, um, these TLS certificates are only used when you're using TLS. That's item number one. Where do you use TLS? And that's actually going to be one of my topics of looking at our inventory. But it's, and web browsers that want an HTTPS, that is TLS. SIP that is using TLS is TLS. In Aura Release 7, you can now have gateways, and you can have your media gateways. Your G450s use TLS as the encryption. You need to have TLS certs there as well. So there's a whole bunch of things that we can do and take a look at. And we are finding very quickly that we have a lot of customers that, because they're scared to death of these certs, because one, I don't want to say the easy part because it's not easy, but we'll say the first step of converting to these new certs, that's the part that is, once you're done, you're done. The second part is, oh, by the way, those certs expire. Okay, they don't last forever. They expire every 1 to 2 years. So you have to go through the process every 1 to 2 years. And the worst thing that you could have happen is not pay attention to your cert expirations, because all of a sudden your stuff is just going to stop working. And we'll talk about all this and why that's interesting and helpful and what we can do with it. So I've got a whole ton of questions coming in, but I think most of these are similar to what we've been doing. So these are the strategies that we can look at. These are the options that we have in moving from old to new. One, it's valid. I'm not saying it's good, but you could continue to use the weak, crappy demo certs and keep fighting off your security auditors and say, hey, no, we really like our SHA-1 cert, and they can be like, you need to fix it. You could keep going that route. It's not advisable, but you could do it. Once those expire, however, they'll expire. Granted, I think the root trust cert expires in 2027. Then there's nothing you can do. It's just going to die. But you'll see other things happening long before that. You could, in theory, use your existing IT department's enterprise root certificate authority. And so one of the questions was, is there a way to make this so that they're more readily available, that they're already deployed? Hey, like at Arrow, if I were to use my shared technologies certificate authority to sign my session manager, sign my communication manager, sign my Aura messaging, all of the computers within Arrow already trust that certificate authority. And so I don't have to do anything. I could just replace all the certs with something signed by my own internal enterprise certificate authority, and boom, I'm done. And I'm going to talk about advantages, disadvantages to all these. Another is to use System Manager as your root certificate authority. And I'll call it an enterprise. I don't mean to imply that it would replace your existing enterprise. You probably have two now, right? Your IT department uses their existing one, and you in the telecom group use your System Manager. There's huge advantages to that. I'm a big fan of it because it makes life easier for certain products. One, as mentioned in the questions, is, hey, can I use System Manager as an intermediate CA of your enterprise CA? And the answer is yes, you can. It is technically possible to if you can convince your IT department to make your System Manager an intermediate CA, now System Manager can sign certificates on behalf of your existing enterprise root CA. And now it's the same deal. You get the separation where you can sign your own stuff, but because the enterprise root CA has already been deployed to your entire enterprise, now you're doing it on behalf of, and that's an option. I never see that happen, to be honest, because most IT departments are going to be like, I'm going to give you signing to do what? No, I'm not going to let you do that. You need a cert from me, come to me. That's what I typically see, but just know that it is very technically possible. You could use commercial certs like Thought, VeriSign, Symantec, GoDaddy, right, and use those publicly, because every computer, every iPhone, every Android on the planet already are told to trust those certificate authorities. They came like that fresh out of the box. In reality, I think you're going to use a combination of the above. You might use this commercial certs for external stuff, and you'll use your enterprise CA for the internal stuff. But, everybody has a little differing view on it. And I'm going to burn through these pretty quick, but kind of give you a rough idea of what's happening because I've got advantages, disadvantages. Again, you can go back and look at this to get more details, but you've got your roots, your Avaya crappy. Think of that as the crappy demo cert that they gave to you. When you, in a release 5 or a release 6 communication manager or session manager, when you installed that, it already had a certificate on it. You didn't need to sign it, you didn't need to do anything. It just magically happened. And they're crappy, right? So advantages, hey, it's easy, right? It's still there. And a lot of Avaya's devices are, like I said before, trust it. They have extended expiration dates. We've been kind of using them for a while. The disadvantages, they are not unique. That certificate authority is used everywhere. Those certs are in fact used almost everywhere. They, by NIST standards, are defined as weak cipher strength. So I guarantee you'll fail security audits that they'll pull and they'll say, yeah, you're using SHA-1 certs, get rid of them. They don't meet NIST standards today. And Avaya is going to, they're drawing a line in the sand saying, we're not doing this again. We are going to let these expire, and once they do, they're gone, they're dead, you're on your own. Now, I make it sound like this is a bad thing. Your IT department lives and breathes certificates. They do it every single day. They've got processes. They expire. They know how to deal with it. They track it, all of that kind of stuff. So one possible scenario is let your IT guys do this, right? You let your IT people deploy your certs because maybe they're good at managing them. Maybe they're good at monitoring expirations, and maybe they will warn you far enough in advance so that you can replace them and renew them when you need to. And those are all big maybes, right? Because sometimes IT departments aren't that good at that stuff. My IT department is actually very good. The ones that we do publicly, we go through internal IT. My problem is they don't give me enough notice. So like our conferencing service, conferencing.aeros3.com, we got a notification about a week in advance that, hey, just so you know, that cert we created or signed for you a while back, it's expiring. We sucked at monitoring it internally within our telecom team, and we got a notice, but it was, boy, we were scrambling to say, oh crap, now I got to not only renew it, but now I got to go find it, and I got to go get it ready and renew them within all of these various systems. The good news is, so we're internally, like I said, creating an offer that's going to help monitor this for customers. We do a lot of device monitoring for customers today, 9 million some ports. And so one of the things that we're going to create an offer to scan your system, figure out what you have, keep track of it, and automatically alert people and assist you as needed to renew those certs. So if that is interesting to you, boy, let me know, let your Aero account rep know, and we can absolutely help you with that stuff. The disadvantage of this, of using the existing enterprise cert, is there are some things that Avaya has done really well, like specifically Session Manager, Presence. You can enroll those devices when you're installing them, and they automatically issue the CSR to System Manager and automatically return the cert and automatically install it. I like automatically, right? So that works out well for some of Avaya's devices. My biggest complaint clearly is that not all of Avaya's devices do that. So you don't enroll everything, like you don't enroll Communication Manager, and so it doesn't have a mechanism to accomplish that. You could, again, I like the idea of using System Manager as your root CA. And again, I'm not saying for your entire company, but for your Avaya stuff, right? So again, the enrollment concept works out really well. It lets you be independent. When you need to spin up a server, you can sign your own stuff, right? You don't have to go coordinate it with somebody else. Most bigger organizations have a good process. Like when I need a public cert, I go to our broader IT department. I say, hey, we need a cert. They say, and I say, here's my CSR. They say, fantastic, and I can usually get that turned around within hours on an emergency basis internally. Usually, hey, if we get it a day later, but there's a generally streamlined practices. It just depends on how you're going to do that and what your comfort level is with your other departments within your company. Are they good at that? Are they not good at that? Should you take it on? And it's about timing, maybe. It's about coordination. It's about all that stuff. You should know that, as you can probably imagine, your enterprise doesn't trust your system manager yet, right? So this is where, again, at least once, you got to go to your IT department and say, hey, can you push this cert, this certificate authority, this root cert out to all the computers in our enterprise so that they are programmed automatically to trust anything that system manager signs. And so you have to do that. Otherwise, it's kind of pointless. You won't get any of your devices to know. So you have to kind of make sure that they've got that and be ready for it. Certainly not, even if it is the enterprise or a version of the enterprise, they're not deployed to the public. So you, my grandma, my friend from California, they're not going to be able to trust my stuff unless, I mean, they have no automated way to do it for sure. So I'd have to go ahead and give them maybe manually, hey, click on this link to download the cert, or here's the cert in a file that maybe I emailed to you. So there are different ways that you could pull that out, but you have to think about how am I going to deploy the trusted root cert to everybody so that they trust my system manager. Yeah, not rocket science, but it's a task that definitely needs to be done. You could use System Manager as an intermediate CA. So in this example, you have your IT department's certificate authority, but they have authorized System Manager to sign certificates on their behalf. Well, the big advantage of that is you still get to leverage the enrollment concepts with System Manager, but the big one is it lets you, the existing root CA that your IT department has already deployed to every computer through group policy or the MDM solution now trusts our stuff. So you're leveraging the fact that your IT department has already figured out how to deploy that trust cert along with it. So now they trust anything that you're going to sign. Again, I understand that it's those things may not be deployed to the enterprise by default. Somebody's got to deploy even the enterprise cert, but that's almost always taken care of for you. The biggest one though is I've yet to find any IT department that buys into that concept. They don't want to relinquish control. So maybe you've got a cooler department or whatever, but I've yet to see a customer of any decent size be willing to do that. Now, if you are a smaller organization and you are all of the above, you are the enterprise, you are the telecom, now that probably works out really well because you might be the enterprise CA person. And that just know that some devices expect to see the full trust chain, it's called. So not only seeing the cert, but knowing that it's trusted by System Manager, knowing that that is trusted by your enterprise CA. It just kind of depends on the devices. We're finding iPhone doesn't need to see it, Android does, so you might have to think about some of the endpoints a little bit differently. And then the last one is just to show maybe you have the third party. This is, again, the VeriSigns, the GoDaddies. The big advantage is every computer on the planet, every smartphone on the planet, it comes preloaded to trust those well-known root certificates. There's several disadvantages, by the way. The biggest one is the short expirations. I mean, they're almost always a year, maybe 2 years tops. They can be expensive, and I've like if you were to go to GoDaddy and buy a certificate, it's about, I don't know, $70 to $100 per cert. So depending on how many identity certs you need, that could get expensive. As an example, Session Manager has 4 just with Session Manager because there are different tasks. There's one for the browser, there's one for the SIP trunks, there's one for other things, the PPM data, there's a couple of them in there. So you need multiple identity certs. So that could be the biggest one, is the cost. Now, I have seen and heard some companies say, no, we've got this screaming deal because we buy so many public identity certs, we get them really, really cheap. And then some customers I hear in finance, I hear in some government high security environments, they've made a mandate 100% public certs, end of story, no questions. Like, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. Not terribly common, but we're starting to see it more and more. And I don't know if it's just because of the deployment of that root CA that they find that difficult, so they do that, or if they just tend to trust those more. Could be a lot of different things. But bottom line, know that you have options. you could do any or all of the above to deploy that and do what you need to do. I'm going to go eyeball some questions here again. So question of, there's such a thing as wildcard certs. I have found some devices handle wildcard certs well and some don't. So I can't give you an absolute yes or no. Like I said, some do, some don't. I can tell you that we've had pretty good luck, using the the subject alternative name. I think where you can, to have multiple names. For the FQDN, one of the things we look for is the fully qualified domain name of whatever you're addressing, and it's got to match. And so sometimes you can put in aliases for that. So I've seen that work out okay in some scenarios. But again, you got to check with the device to know if it's going to work like that. Who keeps TLS off of? Yeah, so one was more of a comment of some people, they actively choose to not use TLS simply because of the expiration. That's an option, right? You could continue to have error messages when you go to a web page saying it's not valid. You could continue to not encrypt your traffic, because you don't want to use TLS. I'd caution you on that. I think everybody's doing TLS, or everybody's doing encryption nowadays, and so it's becoming more standard. I am not a fan of doing unencrypted traffic anywhere, even inside your enterprise, but that's me. I internally within Arrow, I make sure that all of our traffic from like my phone, actually I'm talking on the PC, but on my telephone, I'm encrypted from my phone to the trunk that goes out our network. Obviously, once it hits the carrier, if I were, at T1s, I can't do anything. I can't encrypt that. But I'm actually all SIP trunks here at Arrow, so we could, in theory, encrypt that. But you find a lot of carriers don't actually do TLS encryption. But anytime you're going to do encryption, you have to do TLS. End of story. You have to. There's no other option to do encryption without using TLS in the SIP world. Again, specifically to CS1000, these still absolutely apply, but it depends on, are you doing encryption? Because I guarantee, well, maybe can't guarantee, if you're using Session Manager, right, which is the new NRS, the network routing server, if you're doing TLS, man, you're going, this all absolutely applies. And does Arrow have training? Well, this is step one, kind of freebie, but a lot of it is, at this point it tends to be very, very customized, so it's really more professional services engagements on some of that stuff. Different authorities, again, I think more making a comment. Can System Manager be the CA for iPhones with SLA Mon? That's a really good question that was just brought to my attention yesterday. So the question was, SLA Mon deals in certificates as well, so that the SLA Mon, now called ADS, the Avaya or Advanced Diagnostic Server, has the ability to control iPhone or IP phones. Well, so they deal in certs, and I'm not an SLA Mon expert, but I don't think to put an identity cert on every single phone typically is a protocol that they use called 802.1x. And that's, I don't think, is a requirement. So I don't know this for a fact, but I'm questioning whether or not you actually need identity certs on the phone. What you might need is just to make sure to push the certificate authority trust cert to the phones, which we are absolutely going to talk about here. So I'm going to keep plugging away at some of these topics here. Let's see, we have... Next, we start looking at the inventory. This is where, at a high level, where you're going to see TLS, and therefore you are going to need security certificates. So System Manager as a whole, right? You need System Manager, and the big thing that's going to be there is one, the HTTP. When you go to HTTPS System Manager IP address, whatever that is, or the FQDN, to go to the website, and the website is going to be encrypted. That's a security certificate. The management interface that you don't really see, but when you make a change in System Manager to say, I want to add a new user that has this extension and this voicemail, System Manager has to go talk to the various devices. That is all done encrypted, as you would expect and require. So that requires an identity cert. If you're looking at all at, and I haven't updated on the slide, but engagement development platform, currently known as Breeze. Breeze uses a whole handful of security certificates, depending on whether we're talking about the SIP traffic, the signaling of the voice calls, or the session calls, I should say, and some of the traffic data like PPM and others that might be coming from that. So bottom line is and you'll get a copy of this, you can see all of the traffic flows and all of those things. If you're doing SIP, if you're doing management, if you're doing HTTP, if you're doing a web page, if you're doing PPM, if you're doing XMPP for presence, going to be encrypted, and it's going to require TLS certificates. So this is they're all going to be there. So picture every one of those as a separate identity cert that is going to live within your system. Another thing that you can do is go to Session Manager. Assuming that most of these things connect to Session Manager, Session Manager has a beautiful way to show you what sessions are going on and what encryption they're using. So you access Session Manager via System Manager. So I go to System Manager, I go to the Session Manager page, and then look at technically I go over to the Manage Elements over on the right side under Inventory, and then I can go and look at my individual Session Manager that has been registered as a managed element. I could click on it and say, well, who does Session Manager trust, and what are the identity certificates already installed on there? Okay, so that's one place you can go and kind of see per device. And every device I could click on, if I've got this trusted cert or identity cert not grayed out, that's where you can see it from a central place, as opposed to having to go to each individual device. As an example, again, I'm going to go look at the identity certs that are loaded into my Session Manager, and I can go in and say, oh, it turns out there are 5 identity certs. And I could click on one of them, and it'll tell me the details. You can see how crappy this one is. This is whenever you see the key size of 1024, that's the number of bits in the encryption key. That immediately tells me it's the old SHA-1 cert. I can also kind of see it from, it's using the SIP Product Certificate Authority. I know that happens to be the old one as well. So that tells me that the security module where I'm sending actual voice over IP stuff to Session Manager it's using the old identity cert. Okay. Another really, really cool one to see at a very high level, and this is a fairly recent addition to System Manager and Session Manager. I want to say somewhere in the release 6 timeframe. If you go to, again, you can kind of see it. If you go to Home, go to Elements, go to Session Manager, System Status, and then go to the Security Module Status, you'll see all of the existing connections between Session Manager and whatever else you're talking to. So it could be phones. If you have SIP phones, they'll show up here, connected SIP phones. If you've got a SIP trunk going to Communication Manager, it'll show up here. If you have a SIP trunk going to Aura Messaging, it'll show up here. And what we want to do is click this non-compliant NIST TLS only box and update that. And it'll show you all of the ones, and it'll give you a big old red X saying these suck. Okay, the green ones are good, right? So the encryption is good. But the key exchange is weak, and the actual signer is weak as well. So the certificate authority cert is a weak one there. So the goal is to get rid of all these red ones and turn them to green. And you can go one by one, find out, well, what is that IP address? 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 And hopefully you've got a good inventory of what you are allowing to be connected, whether they are SIP entities, entity links, it's usually where it comes in, or remote devices. So this is a great way to go see. This is your checklist of stuff you got to do and get done. So next, let's talk about how we, as an example, and I can't emphasize enough of how important it is to not take this as, oh, Dave showed me 4 slides and I can update my system. Nope, it is way more complicated than that, and needs a whole lot more time than I have in my remaining minutes left. So what I wanted to do is give you an example of some of the kinds of things you do, and I'm going to show something specific for a SIP phone, talking between the Session Manager and as a sequenced app, ultimately Communication Manager, and making sure that those are updated. Again, cannot emphasize enough, you can't just undo this because you might have broken your messaging, you might have broken your other stuff. There's more to it, but it gives you an example of how we might start looking at these kinds of things. So I'd go to System Manager, I'd go to Security, and one of the items in here is System Manager's Certificate Authority functionality. And I can go in here, and one of the first things you do is you want to get a copy of the Trust Cert. And you can say, give me a copy of that Trust Cert, and now anything signed by, and as long as I distribute that Trust Cert to the devices, anybody who sees that will now trust anything that System Manager signs. Okay, so that's a big step for what we're going to do. If we are going to use System Manager as your certificate authority, you must download that. You must distribute it to all devices before you do anything else. So I'll download that. We'll download it as a PEM formatted file, and just save it to your desktop as whatever. You know, it's usually, I think a lot of people save it as a .txt file of some sort. So maybe systemmanager.txt or something like that. For starters, I need to tell Communication Manager to trust that System Manager as a certificate authority. So the way we do that, we log into Communication Manager, you go to the download section under miscellaneous, and you say click browse. It's going to say great, what's the file? Click, you know, wherever you saved that PEM file that I showed on the previous slide. Do that, give it to Communication Manager. Know that we haven't done anything. All we did was download it to the server. We put it in a folder. That's it. We haven't applied it. We haven't done anything. Because next what you have to do is tell the various components of Communication Manager to trust that. And the way to do that is to go to the menu item called Trusted Certificates, meaning anything that's listed here, Communication Manager or one of its subcomponents will trust something signed by that certificate authority. You can see there's already some that are going to be loaded in there. So in this screenshot, you can see that Communication Manager trusts this thing called the APR-CA.CRT. It's the Avaya product cert. There's a Motorola one in here for some reason. Maybe they had an application that they needed to trust a Motorola product. There's the SIP product cert, you know, the one that's actually doing the voice over IP stuff. And so, I didn't show the screen, but it'll say, well, which of the components of Communication Manager are going to trust it? Because there's actually 4 different things. There's an authentication, authorization and accounting, you know, with LDAP. There's Communication Manager. There's the web server itself to go to. This browser needs one. And even if you want to do like an rsyslog, the remote logging, maybe you want to have that trusted as well. So what you do is you say, I want to add a new certificate authority trust cert, meaning I want Communication Manager to trust a new certificate authority. So you say add, you go give it the file name of whatever you saved it as before. You downloaded it from System Manager, now you already downloaded it to Communication Manager. Now it's saying, what is the file that I can go pull out of that directory in Communication Manager to install into the system? You do it, click open, and now you would, next step, sorry, it'll then say, well, which of the devices do you want me to apply this to? So we'll say, nah, for this scenario, I just wanted to do Communication Manager, and I want you to trust that cert. So Communication Manager will now trust any identity cert signed by System Manager. Click Add, and you're good. You'll see that it shows up in my list. You'll see who it's trusted by. Know, however, that it doesn't actually apply until you restart Communication Manager. That just installing this did nothing, right? It's not service affecting, you know, just adding another trusted certificate. You still trust the old crappy one. It's just now you trust the new good one. Well, nobody has any yet, right? You haven't installed any of those new identity certs, but at least we'll now trust anything that our System Manager does sign in the future. So we've affected nothing by doing this task. Obviously, the restart of Communication Manager is going to be service affecting. Do that out of hours. Do that whenever you need to reboot it, and now that'll be official and supported within that time frame that you need it to be. Now, so not only does Communication Manager trust a cert signed by System Manager, I want my phones to. And again, it starts with SIP phones, but in newer releases of Avaya's SIP phones, even the H.323 IP phones also support TLS for encryption. So it's not just SIP phones. It can also be H.323 phones as well. But we have to tell the phones to go download that new trusted certificate authority so that they will now trust anything that System Manager signs. And you know this, I hope you know this, right? The 46xx settings.txt file, I have a hard time thinking you would have IP phones if you don't know that file. Inside there's this line item that's been there forever called set trust certs. What we are going to do is add one new little entry in here of systemmanager.txt, or whatever you named it, whatever you downloaded from System Manager. You'll put that file in your directory of where the 46xx settings.txt file is, whether that's on your utility server, if you've got an HTTP server, wherever the 46xx settings.txt file is, that's where you're going to put that trust cert. And this just tells the phone that when it boots up, hey, by the way, go get this new trust cert. So again, anybody who knows IP phones, the IP phones only look at this file when they're booting up. So obviously you need it to re-look at this file, which means to reboot your phones. Now it will go download the certificate authority and install it auto-magically into the phone. And now the phone will trust not only old crappy cert, but it will also trust the new System Manager certificate stuff. Okay. Now that we have in this small scoped scenario, right? I'm not talking about a lot of other devices. In this one little scenario, I have my phones and my communication manager trusting certificates that are signed by System Manager. That was the goal. Now the goal is to actually go change the identity certs to the new flavor of identity certs. And this is where every process is going to be different. In my particular scenario, I want to go ahead and tell Session Manager to update a couple of their modules, specifically the security module for SIP and for the PPM type data. So I would go in here and I would click on it. I went back to System Manager under the inventory. I'm on my Session Manager, if you remember all that. And I can see that, okay, here's my identity certs that are installed. And I could see that the security module SIP is there, and it's the old cert. What I would do is click Replace, and it would come up and say, great, tell me about what this new cert is. And you'd say, okay, yeah, it's I want to create a new cert, that's give it the common name, which is the FQDN of your system. Give it the I think the DNS name that's typically where we would put the SIP domain, the IP address. I want to make the key size 2048, and by committing this, what it's going to do is issue a CSR up to System Manager, sign the cert, and give it back down to Session Manager. Okay, so ultimately we're replacing our old identity cert with a new identity cert. Okay, and it'll tell you, it'll say, okay, based on that, when I did this, it was valid from 2014, so that shot was pulled 2014. It actually expires May 15th, 2016, which clearly would have broken by now if this were in any kind of real time. But this gives you an idea of what those expirations are, typically 2 years, right? That's what System Manager is going to assign these for. And you can go in and say, yep, it's updated. The key size has been updated to a new SHA-2 type cert, and I'm living the dream. I also said I wanted to change another module within Session Manager for the HTTPS, both the kind of the browser level as well as the PPM data. So I do the exact same thing, highlight it, say replace, enter the data, and do the exact same stuff I did before. As I mentioned, this is where I could go and start looking to see, okay, I've replaced the identity cert with somebody signed by System Manager. Any device out there that trusts something that's been signed by System Manager is going to work fantastically. If you don't trust System Manager, you just broke the system. Okay, so you got to make sure that all the devices out there they trust System Manager, because System Manager just signed a new identity cert for Session Manager. And again, assuming everything's good, you can go in, you can go run that report again, the inventory, and see that your little green or your red changed to a green, and everything would be fantastic. Now, and obviously that by changing the identity cert, that's when the rubber meets the road. And did you do what you needed to do? Do they trust the cert? And you do it that way. When you're done, and you got to make sure you're really, really done. The ideal goal is to remove the trust for the old cert, because now if you were using the old cert, you're insecure, right? You're no longer NIST compliant. This will remove support for the old cert when you do it. So I would go into in this case, Communication Manager, and that old one, the old crappy one that I don't want to use, I click on it and say remove. Now you don't trust Avaya's old crappy cert anymore. Again, I can't emphasize enough that if you've missed a device that still is using a certificate signed by the old crappy cert, you just broke the system. So this is there's dangerous pieces at a couple different points, but this is a real dangerous one. But this is where, how do you know? Well, you're going to know. when you remove support for the old crappy certificate signed by the old way of doing these things, that's where things are going to fall apart. But that's the goal, right, is to make sure this is compliant and guarantee it's compliant. So remove support for the old one. And obviously you have to restart Communication Manager to make that work. You're also going to need, your phone still trust the old cert, or anything signed by the old certificate authority. So the goal is to go and remove that as part of your phones as well, and again, reboot those. This step doesn't have to be done like night of cut by any means, right? I can almost see these being done in 3 phases. Phase 1, tell everybody to trust System Manager. Nothing's changed. You've not changed any identity certs. It's all non-service affecting as long as you're just adding support for new trusting of new System Manager. The next phase or stage could be to say, now let's go update all of our identity certs, knowing that every device I have trusts System Manager. Great, have System Manager create you some new certs. And then the third thing that could be done at a totally different time is once you're absolutely completely convinced you've got rid of all the old crap, tell the devices to stop doing it, to stop trusting it, and remove trust for the old certificate authority. You notice I am a big fan of not changing lines. Comment them out, okay? Because if all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, I broke everything, and then you're trying to figure out, what did they call that? I don't remember what it was. Well, all I have to do is go back here and say, oh yeah, it was called AV_CIPCA_PAM_2027. You just uncomment it, comment that line out, reboot, and you're in good shape. So I don't like to just randomly change stuff. Comment out the old stuff, add a new line, that way you know how to go back if you need to. And what I would often do is put another comment in here that says, changed by Dave Lover on this date. So somebody else looks at it and say, oh, that was Dave that changed that. That's actually a good thing. This is a huge, huge topic, and you can see I'm over. I knew I was going to go over 10 minutes. Ain't so bad. I thought it was better than I thought it was going to be, but I've got a ton of questions to go through.
Dave, I'm actually thinking maybe we should, we have a lot of good questions, and I'm almost thinking if maybe we should do a question session separately, or answer these questions at another time so we can dedicate more time to them. I think it might be more useful to have a dedicated time to it.
That's totally good.
But
I think how we did it the last time, Kelly. We wrote these down and I just answered them, and then we posted the answers to people's questions.
Right. I mean, I want to make sure that we can, strategically, have everyone's questions answered, so that they can kind of take time and then digest it a little bit. So if that's okay with you, we may just do it that way.
Very good.
All right, perfect.
So then in closing, again, it's a big topic. In an hour, you can't make somebody from a newbie to masterful in this topic, and it can be very, the concepts we've covered. Hopefully, you have a better understanding of what a cert is. What's this idea of a certificate authority? How to validate, right? It's all about validating a certificate and then providing trust to that validation. Give you a high-level overview of where are some of the things that you need to pay attention to within Avaya's environment. TLS is used in way more places than you think it is, and they'll all be part of that. Give you a high-level view of some of your options and some phases that you can think of this, and tips and tricks of how to go look at it, And I give you one very, very limited scope item of how to look at this and the kinds of steps we would use, assuming System Manager is your certificate authority in this environment, assuming that we're just in that very small environment using SIP phones with a communication manager. And but it's valid, it works, and certainly something to play with. So thank you, everybody. As Kelly said, we'll work on getting these questions out to the answers to these questions out to people, and very much appreciate your time, and thanks for sticking around a little bit longer than we initially allocated. So Kelly, back to you.
Yeah, no, thank you. So if you do have a question, I do encourage you to kind of put it in this chat box here so that we can get to it, make sure everyone has the information that they need. We will get those out to you. And next month we have another webinar. Andrew Prokop will be joining us on October 20th, and he will be talking about the fundamentals of Avaya Breeze. So we will be sending out a link to register for that. It's also on the screen, but we will be sending it out when we send out a copy of the recording and a copy of the presentation from today's presentation. So thank you all for joining, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks.